A man woke up one morning with nothing. His business had collapsed overnight. His savings were gone. His family was looking at him across the breakfast table, waiting for answers he didn't have. 3 years later, he was debt-free, his business had been rebuilt from scratch, and people were asking him one question everywhere he went: how? The answer wasn't a financial strategy. It wasn't a lucky investment. It was 2 verses hidden in the middle of a letter written by a man in chains. And those 2 verses contain the most powerful financial framework ever written. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how it works. If you're new here, this channel exists to show you what the Bible actually says about money. Not what religion made it say, but what it really says. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, because what we're about to uncover today changes everything. Now, before we get into the formula itself, because there is a formula and it's specific and it works, we need to understand where it came from. Because these words weren't written in a palace. They weren't written from financial abundance. They were written in conditions that would have broken most people completely. And that context is going to change the way you read these verses forever. The city of Philippi was one of the most strategically important Roman colonies in the entire empire. Located in what is now northern Greece, it sat along the Via Egnatia, the main military road connecting Rome to the eastern territories. This wasn't a quiet town. It was a city built on power. Roman veterans had been given land there as retirement rewards.
The culture was Roman, the law was Roman, the economic system was Roman, and Roman economic systems were brutal for anyone who wasn't already wealthy. Social class determined everything: your birth, your citizenship status, your connections. These decided whether you thrived or barely survived. And inside that city, a small community of believers existed. They weren't powerful, they weren't wealthy, but they had something that the Roman financial system couldn't provide and couldn't take away. This church had a very specific history with the Apostle Paul. He had founded it, and the story of how that happened is one of the most dramatic founding stories in the entire New Testament. Paul arrived in Philippi after receiving a vision, a Macedonian man calling out to him, pleading for help. He crossed into Europe for the first time as a missionary, and within days of arriving, his life was in chaos. He met a woman named Lydia, a successful businesswoman, a seller of purple cloth, which was an extremely expensive luxury good reserved for the wealthy elite. She was financially successful by any standard of her time. She heard Paul speak, she believed, and she opened her home. That was the first European conversion recorded in Scripture, and it happened in the context of commerce, of work, of a woman operating in the marketplace. But the story doesn't stop there. Shortly after, Paul and his companion Silas were arrested. They were publicly beaten. They were thrown into the deepest part of the prison, their feet locked in stocks. No trial, no defense, no due process, just the raw exercise of power over 2 men with no political protection. And here is where the story gets extraordinary, because this is the moment most people would have completely fallen apart.
Instead, at midnight, Paul and Silas were singing. Not crying, not begging. Singing worship songs loud enough for every prisoner in that facility to hear them. And then an earthquake struck. Every door flew open. Every chain broke loose. And the jailer, who was about to take his own life out of fear, ended up on his knees asking Paul and Silas how to be saved. He and his entire household were baptized that same night. Think about what that church witnessed before it ever became a church. It watched God work in the middle of financial injustice, wrongful imprisonment, and complete powerlessness. The people of Philippi didn't just hear a sermon about trusting God with money and circumstances. They saw what that trust actually looked like in real time, under real pressure. That foundation matters, because the letter Paul is about to write to them, the letter where our passage lives, is not written by someone who theorized about peace. It was written by someone who sang at midnight in chains. And that changes everything about how we should receive what he says. Now, years after founding that church, Paul is in prison again. This time, it's Rome. This isn't a local misunderstanding with a city magistrate. He is now in the hands of the most powerful judicial system in the world, waiting for a verdict from the emperor himself, a verdict that could mean execution. The stakes couldn't be higher. The uncertainty couldn't be greater. And yet he writes a letter that doesn't sound like a man on death row. The word joy appears over a dozen times.
The tone throughout is calm, grateful, focused. He's not writing a financial disaster memoir. He's writing a letter about contentment.
The Philippines had sent him financial support, a gift carried by a man named Epaphroditus, who nearly died making the journey. They weren't a wealthy congregation. They gave sacrificially. And Paul responds not just with gratitude, but with teaching, because he knows they're going through their own battles. Financial pressure, social pressure, living in a Roman colony with a Roman economy when your values are fundamentally at odds with Rome's values. They needed what he was about to say just as much as he needed to say it. He builds toward the passage in a very specific sequence. First, he tells them to rejoice, always. Then he tells them to let their gentleness be known to everyone, because the Lord is near. And then he gives them the formula. Pay attention to that word, near. The nearness of God is not just a theological statement. In a financial context, it means the most powerful resource in existence is immediately accessible to you. Not after you clean up your situation, not after you increase your income, right now, in whatever state your bank account is in. That foundation sets the stage for what comes next. Philippians 4:6 begins with a statement that is simultaneously a command and a challenge. That phrase in the original Greek uses the word merimnao, a word that describes a mind being pulled apart in different directions, divided between competing fears, unable to settle. It's the mental state of someone lying awake at 3 a.m. doing math they've already done 50 times, calculating outcomes they can't control, rehearsing worst-case scenarios they can't prevent. And Paul, this man in chains, this man whose future is literally unknown, says, for nothing. No qualifier, no category of exception. Nothing. Zero. The word is absolute.
Now, does that mean financial planning is wrong? Does it mean budgeting is lack of faith? Does it mean you should stop thinking strategically about your money? Absolutely not. And here's a distinction that changes everything. There is a critical difference between prudent planning and anxious ruminating. Prudent planning takes action based on available information and trusts God with the rest. Anxious ruminating circles the same problem endlessly without reaching any productive decision. One is stewardship, the other is a trap, and Paul is commanding you out of the trap. But notice what he does immediately after giving the command. He doesn't just say, stop worrying, and leave you there. He gives you the replacement behavior, the thing you do instead. Because a command without a method is just frustration, and God is not in the business of frustration. He is in the business of transformation. This single sentence is more sophisticated than it looks. Let's pull it apart, because every word is doing work. In everything, not some things, not the big things, not the things that seem spiritual enough to bring to God. Everything. That crushing credit card balance, the business decision you've been agonizing over, the conversation you need to have with your spouse about money, the client you're afraid to lose, the investment you don't understand. Everything. By prayer and supplication, Paul uses two different Greek words here deliberately. Proseke, which refers to general prayer, the ongoing relational communication with God, the posture of your life being directed toward Him, and diesis, which refers to specific targeted requests, naming the actual need, the real number, the concrete situation. Paul is saying, don't be vague with God.
Don't just say, Lord, help with my finances, and leave it there. Tell Him the amount. Tell Him the deadline. Tell Him what you're afraid of specifically. He already knows, but you need to articulate it, because the act of articulating it transforms your relationship to the problem. This is not a polite addition. This is not spiritual etiquette. Thanksgiving is the mechanism through which the entire formula works. Here's why. Anxiety is fundamentally a problem of focus. When you're financially anxious, your mind is locked on to what you don't have, what might go wrong, what you might lose. Gratitude redirects that focus, not by ignoring the problem, but by repositioning you in relation to it. You start to see your current need against the background of God's consistent provision throughout your life. You remember the time money appeared when there was no logical reason it should have. You remember the bill that got reduced, the job that came through, the unexpected check. You're not pretending the current problem doesn't exist. You're placing it inside a larger story where God has a consistent track record. And here is something psychologically and spiritually profound. You cannot be genuinely thankful and simultaneously convinced that God has abandoned you.
Those two states are mutually exclusive. Real gratitude carries within it an implicit trust, a memory of faithfulness that makes future faithfulness believable. This is why Paul includes it in the formula, because gratitude is the door through which faith walks. Picture this: you're facing a significant financial shortfall. The old response is to lie awake running numbers, drafting mental catastrophe scenarios, feeling the walls close in. The formula looks like this instead. You stop. You actually stop.
God, here's the situation. The number is X. The deadline is Y. I don't see a path forward. I'm bringing this to you specifically, not vaguely. And while I ask you to provide, I'm going to remember you've never left me with nothing. There was the time that, specific memory. There was the year when, specific provision. You were faithful then. And then you leave the room, metaphorically speaking, and you let God work. Something shifts when you do that. Not necessarily the bank balance, not immediately, but you shift. And a person operating from peace makes fundamentally better financial decisions than a person operating from panic. We'll come back to that in a moment because it's crucial. Now look at what happens immediately after you apply verse 6. The promise in verse 7 is automatic, not conditional on your situation improving, not waiting for the problem to be solved. Automatic. Every word of that sentence deserves attention. The peace of God, not your peace, not peace you manufactured through positive thinking or controlled breathing or sheer mental discipline. The peace that belongs to God Himself. The peace that exists within the nature of a being who knows the end from the beginning, who holds every system in existence in His hands. That peace becomes yours. Not a version of it, not an imitation of it. That peace, which surpasses all understanding. The Greek word here is hupereko, meaning to rise above, to exceed, to be categorically superior to. This peace does not operate within the logic of your circumstances. It doesn't wait for your circumstances to make sense before it arrives. It comes before the situation is resolved. It functions in the absence of answers. It was present in Paul's prison cell before the earthquake.
It is available in your financial crisis before the breakthrough. It is not a reward for already being okay. It is the resource God gives you for navigating not being okay. Will guard your hearts and your minds. That word guard is phrurio in Greek, a military term. It describes a garrison of soldiers stationed around a city to prevent enemy forces from entering. This is not a passive metaphor. The peace of God does not simply exist around you. It actively prevents certain things from gaining access to your interior life. Panic cannot get through it. Despair cannot breach it. The kind of financial fear that causes people to make desperate, destructive decisions, it cannot penetrate the garrison. Your thought processes, your emotional stability, your capacity to see clearly, all of it is being actively protected. In Christ Jesus. And here's the location of all of this. Not in your own strength, not in your ability to maintain composure, in a relationship. This peace is not a technique you master, it's a position you occupy. As long as you remain connected to Christ, the garrison remains. The moment you try to generate financial peace through your own control, your own strategies, your own anxiety management, you've stepped outside the protection. The peace of God is not available to those who don't need God. It's available to those who actually bring their need to Him. Now, let's talk about what this looks like in real financial life, because Paul wasn't writing theory, and this channel doesn't exist to give you theory either. The most common financial application of anxiety is what I'd call the control trap. You believe that if you just knew enough, tracked enough, optimized enough, worried enough, you could prevent bad outcomes.
So you check your accounts obsessively. You run the same numbers every night. You research every possible scenario. You lose sleep doing calculations that don't change because the variable you're trying to control isn't in your spreadsheet. It's in God's hands. The formula doesn't tell you to stop paying attention to your finances. It tells you to stop worshiping them, to stop treating financial certainty as the thing that determines whether you can be at peace. You can be a disciplined, attentive steward of money, budgeting carefully, planning wisely, making strategic decisions, while simultaneously holding all of it with an open hand, recognizing that God is the ultimate source and ultimate security. Think about Lydia again, the businesswoman who opened her home to Paul. She didn't stop selling purple cloth after she became a believer. She didn't abandon her commercial life. She brought her faith into it. Her success continued, but now it was held differently, not as the source of her security, but as a resource in service of something larger than herself.
That's the posture the formula produces. Not irresponsibility, not passivity, not pretending money doesn't matter, but a fundamentally different relationship to it, one where money is a tool rather than an identity, a resource rather than a god, a responsibility rather than a source of ultimate worth. Consider the area of debt specifically, because debt is one of the heaviest financial burdens people carry, and anxiety around debt is uniquely paralyzing. Debt has a way of making people feel morally condemned, perpetually behind, never able to catch up, and that shame and anxiety often prevents the very clear thinking needed to actually address it.
People in debt anxiety often avoid opening mail, avoid looking at statements, avoid conversations about money, because the anxiety is too painful, and avoidance makes everything worse. The formula interrupts that cycle. When you bring your actual debt to God in prayer, not a vague, "Lord, help with my finances," but, "Lord, the number is X dollars spread across these specific accounts, and I don't know how to address it with my current income," something breaks open. You've named the enemy. You've stopped letting it grow in the dark. And then you give thanks, not because you're pretending the debt doesn't exist, but because you're remembering that the God who is about to help you is the same God who has already sustained you. The peace that arrives doesn't dissolve the debt, but it gives you the mental clarity to actually make a plan and the emotional stability to execute it without collapsing. That difference in decision-making capacity is not small. Research consistently shows that financial stress significantly impairs cognitive function. The very thinking you need most when money is tight becomes hardest to access under anxiety. The peace of God, functioning as a garrison around your mind, is literally protecting your ability to think clearly about your money. This is not just spiritual poetry, it's a functional advantage. Let's also talk about an area the original text touches on that is especially relevant for this channel, the relationship between gratitude and generosity. Because one of the most counterintuitive financial principles in the Bible is that generosity is not the activity of people who have enough, it's the activity of people who trust that they will have enough. The Philippians gave to Paul from their financial scarcity. They weren't wealthy, but they had applied the formula. They had learned, through watching Paul, through experiencing God's faithfulness themselves, that their security was not in their reserves, it was in their relationship with God, and that freed them to give. There is a direct line between Philippians 4:6-7 and generosity. When you are anxious, you hoard. When you are anxious, every financial decision is filtered through fear, and fear does not produce generosity. But when the peace of God is guarding your heart, when you have genuinely placed your needs in God's hands with thanksgiving, when you are operating from trust rather than scarcity, your hands open. Not because you're ignoring wisdom, but because you know who the real provider is, and you can give strategically, generously, and joyfully because your peace doesn't depend on keeping everything for yourself. Now, let's be honest about something. This formula is not a one-time event. It's not something you apply once in a financial crisis and then return to anxiety as usual for the next decade. Paul makes this clear throughout the letter. The entire posture of the Philippian correspondence is one of continuous practice. Rejoice always, not rejoice once. In everything, not in the major categories. The formula is a lifestyle. Which means the question isn't, did you apply Philippians 4:6-7 when you lost your job in 2020? The question is, are you applying it at 11 p.m. tonight when the mortgage math isn't working? Are you applying it when you open the credit card statement? Are you applying it in the moment between receiving bad financial news and your first emotional response? Because here's what actually happens when you practice this consistently over time. You stop chasing peace and you start living from peace.
There's an enormous difference. Chasing peace means your emotional state is always downstream of your circumstances. You feel okay when things are okay and anxious when things are uncertain. Living from peace means your stability exists upstream of your circumstances. You bring a settled, anchored quality into situations before you know how they'll resolve, because your security is located somewhere that circumstances can't touch. That's what Paul had. That's why he could write a joyful letter from prison. Not because the prison wasn't real, not because the chains weren't heavy, but because his peace was located in something the Roman emperor had no jurisdiction over. And that peace is available to you, not someday, not once your financial situation improves,
right now, in the current state of your accounts, with the current pressure you're under, with the current uncertainty you're facing. The formula is this: name your specific financial need out loud to God. Don't be vague, be exact. Bring the number, the deadline, the fear. Then choose gratitude deliberately. Remember a specific time God provided when provisions seemed impossible, and anchor your trust to that memory. Let your requests and your thanksgiving arrive together. And then receive, not passively, but actively, the peace that begins to guard the part of you that was most panicking. Do this not once, but every time the anxiety returns. Every time you check your account and feel the grip of fear. Every time a bill arrives that you don't know how to pay. Every time the future looks financially uncertain. Return to the formula. Not because it's magic, but because you're returning repeatedly to the God who has always been faithful, and reminding yourself and Him that you know it.
Paul didn't find contentment in prison because he was naturally stoic. He said explicitly in this same letter that contentment was something he learned in every season, in abundance, and in need. It's learnable. It's a practiced skill. And Philippians 4:6-7 is the practice. In a world where financial anxiety is endemic, where people are making major life decisions driven by fear, where debt is growing because panicked decisions compound problems rather than solving them, where stress about money is fracturing relationships and stealing sleep and shortening lives, a person who has genuine peace in their financial life is extraordinary. Not because they have everything figured out, not because their accounts are always full, but because they know where their security actually lives. Because they've learned to bring the need, add the thanks, and receive the peace. Because they've stopped trying to control what only God can handle and started trusting the one who handles everything. That's the life Philippians 4:6-7 makes available. Not financial perfection, financial peace. Not the absence of problems, the presence of God in the middle of them. The complete peace that Paul describes does not come from controlling everything. It comes from trusting everything to the one who already controls it all. If this message helped you see these verses differently, if it landed in a place where you needed it, share it with someone carrying financial anxiety right now. They need this formula too. And if you want to keep going deeper into what the Bible actually teaches about money, faith, and living with purpose, subscribe and stay with us. We're just getting started. What financial topic from Scripture do you want to explore next? Drop it in the comments. Let's study it together.